of the basics of training, evaluation, and of course, record keeping. And it is brought to you by none other than me. Brian asked me to provide a segment on this. And so, as you all know, I'm owner and senior consultant and trainer of Safety, Health, and Environmental Services. And we provide comprehensive outsourced risk management and a lot of certification training, including lift training. And so I'm going to take some time to talk to you today about what it takes to be in compliance with documentation, because what I have seen, folks, is that there's a lot of documentation that's inadequate out there in the industry, or just lack thereof. And I want to be sure that everybody's on the same page and understands the resources that are available to them and the plethora of information that floats out there on the interweb, and ensure that we have our folks dialed in and trained up per code and regulation. So I'm going to share a different screen here. Let's see what I can do to get this screen up. I'm going to switch over, folks. Give me one moment. All right. Can everybody see that presentation? Mr. Ducey, can you see? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, forklift and powered industrial trucks, understanding the basics in training, evaluation, and record keeping. I have my contact information there if anybody has any questions or needs moving forward, as well as company website. But I want to talk about some of the basics here, and hopefully you haven't seen any of these racing around on your job sites, but I found it quite fascinating to see a souped up forklift for those fast-paced jobs. But we all know that forklifts are a well-known workhorse throughout the industries. And there's a variety of shapes and sizes of these forklifts that have the ability to move loads from one location to the next. And they can weigh 5,000 pounds up to 50,000 pounds, depending on the type of model that you are operating. And there's a lot of folks that might not be familiar with all of the different types of classifications of forklifts. And I'll share that with you here in just a few slides. But with a machine this powerful, there's always a potential for injury. And as Randy just mentioned, with the labor and industries, is that we had several motor vehicle accidents. Now, that doesn't necessarily involve forklifts, but we do see high statistics across the country in both construction and fixed industry alike, where individuals, operators, pedestrians have had encounters, unwanted encounters with forklifts or unwanted circumstances, and the result has been injury and even death. Now, some forklifts condense sizes. They'll enable an operator to move quickly in areas with tight logistics. We use this equipment throughout the construction industry on a regular basis. And other vehicles can drive up to 20 miles an hour, which hopefully nobody's pell-melling around a project going 20 miles an hour. But they do have the ability, depending on the make and model. And that speed combined with the powerful lifting capabilities can lead to some serious trouble if you don't have your operators properly trained, folks. We have to make sure that we have that documentation dialed in, and that we're making sure that we're performing our evaluations per Washington Administrative Code and federal OSHA. And I'm going to share some of that ins and outs with you as we move forward. Now, forklift classifications, as I mentioned, these power industrial trucks covered by the DOSH standard, there's many different types. And like other power industrial trucks, its purpose is to move, push, carry, pull, lift material, load, then stack it in place, you name it. And because of their different shapes and sizes, they have different classifications, and they can be powered by batteries, propane, gasoline, diesel fuel, electric, and some are designed to be used in hazardous locations or atmospheric conditions where an ordinary forklift may cause a fire or explosion, generating sparks, or in conjunction with a common term, direct induction, when we are operating these lifts. And so we have to make sure that we are using the right lift for the job and environment of where we are working. And so you can understand the importance of training personnel to understand these different types of equipment and the hazards associated with lifts in specific environments. And I'll, of course, folks, look, this is not forklift training. This is just understanding the basics of training. So yes, we could dive in and we could talk about this for hours, but this is just a general overview of what we need to do as managers and professionals and coordinators to make sure that our people have the training and information needed to work safely. And here is a forklift classification chart. This is actually pulled directly from a document that is provided by Department of Labor and Industries, or DOSH, which is also a great resource for information if you are planning on developing a training program, or if you are just trying to verify what a code or regulation says. I would highly recommend going to Department of L&I website and doing a quick search to land you in the area of forklifts, of the standards and training material that has been produced. And so as you can see here, we have a variety of different classifications, 1 through 7. Class 6 is something that we don't see forklifts in, but we do see for Class 1 electric motor, rider, counterbalance trucks. And you'll also notice in parentheses, these can be classified or very similar, but based on the type of tires, whether they're solid or pneumatic. Class 2 is your electric motor, narrow aisle trucks with solid tires. Class 3 is electric motor hand trucks or hand rider trucks. Now, we probably don't see these as much in construction as we might see in a warehouse setting, but they still do exist. And so, in fact, I just did a training on that day before yesterday with Class 2s and 3s. So we do run into these oftentimes. Now, Class 4 is and Class 5 is what we will generally see, as well as a Class 7, which is a rough terrain, or also known as an all-terrain. But that Class 4 and 5 deal with the internal combustion engines. Again, you can see the difference between those is solid and pneumatic tires between those classifications. And every truck that falls under these classifications of forklifts has to have specific training in that classification. So I'm just going to repeat that. One standard training does not cover everybody to operate any lift. You have to have specific details on the types of lifts that they were being asked to operate. Now, the most recent data that I could find from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and when I'm developing presentations, I love to look at the BLS and check out their numbers. And they're a few years behind in most cases, but the BLS has shown that there were almost 8,000 forklift-related injuries, and that's an increase of about 6% from the previous year. And so we've seen that the trend is on the increase, and the industry also has very different employment trends across the U.S., as you all know, which do tell a story of the changing landscape for heavy machinery operators. And again, I have to fall back on what Randy just said is, hey, we have a number of fatalities related to machine operators, not necessarily forklifts, but we do see the comparison there. Now, forklift safety, y'all have to remember that even with proper training, injuries can and do occur on construction sites, and also catastrophic injuries as well. And I wanted to show you a few key accident and injury statistics in the forklift industry before we jump into the training, evaluation, and record keeping portion, which I thought were interesting. I just have a handful of them here. Some of you may not be able to see the fine print here, but what you can see is 70% of forklift accidents could have been prevented by standard safety measures. And that is derived from investigations. But if you look down to the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice that 1 in 6 workplace deaths involve a forklift. You know, holy cow. I mean, that's a staggering number. Now, when we look to the middle section of this slide, we'll see that about 62,000 non-serious injuries related to forklift accidents each year, and about 35,000 serious injuries result from forklift accidents annually. And this varies depending on the nature of the industry. I'm going to show you a little more detail on these two graphs here, well, at least the lower right-hand side, but the upper right-hand graph pie chart, you can see the different industries and the percentages of where these injuries and accidents occur. Construction is the second highest at 20%. And then, of course, fixed industry falls into 45%. And, of course, the actual personnel hours worked in fixed industry settings is absolutely much higher than it is in construction, with construction still being the third most dangerous industry to work in. And you can see some of the other smaller pieces of the pie, 12% wholesale, 11% transport, 10% retail, and 2% in mining. But let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Here's some of the forklift statistics. Everybody's seen this picture before. We've used this at University of Washington. I'm sure some of you have used this before. You have to chuckle, but you also have to cringe or even pucker a little bit based on the thought process that had occurred to perform this operation. Things can get tricky out there, and when people come up with cool ideas, it's usually an unsafe idea. So if you ever hear anyone say regarding operations, hey, that's a cool idea, that's time to stop and check your brain and look, assess, and manage at what's going on, and make sure that we've addressed all the safety aspects of that. But let's take a closer look at some of these statistics. There's about 8,000 non-fatal forklift injuries in 2018, and just under 88%. So almost 90% happened to males, and 12% happened to females. Now, forklift and industrial truck accidents are responsible for an average, and we saw this on the previous slide. There's about 1,700 non-fatal forklift injuries that occurred to operators between 25 to 34, making it the highest injured group. So here we see a specific age group, and I just want you all to think about that and analyze it for a moment, is that because that is the highest risk category, should we be focusing more on the evaluation process and ensuring that maybe that younger population coming into the industry does have experience and understands these basic fundamentals of safe operation of forklifts. Now, service providing industries like warehouses, transportation, utilities had the highest injury total overall in any industry. And as I mentioned, that's just because of the man hours worked, and about 5,400 forklift related injury cases, according to Bureau of Labor and Statistics in 2018. And then a few other statistics to share. Between about 2011 and 2018, an average of 7% of workers missed work each year due to forklift related injuries. And as you all know, that's time loss, and that does impact the bottom line. And in 2018, the 3 leading injuries from forklift accidents were fractures, and you can see the numbers associated with those, bruises and contusions, and then sprains and muscle tears. And a little bit deeper digging into the web will show you some of those different those statistics, and we'll expand on what has occurred based on the root cause analysis. Now, non-fatal workplace injuries, this is a little bit easier chart to take a look at here. You can see sprains and injuries was 2%, fractures was 1%. We had a few amputations there, but fractures took the top at 22%. We have bruises and contusions, 20, sprains and strains, 19%, soreness and pain, 19%, and this can vary depending on the circumstances. And then a few others as well accounted for the other small piece of the pie, and cuts, lacerations, and punctures came in at 5%. And this was derived from Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Like I said, if any of you are out there developing any training programs, I encourage you to take a look at the BLS. They have a lot of charts and information that is available for you to use in any course instruction. Now we have to look at the nitty-gritty, which is forklift fatalities. OSHA reported that the leading cause of forklift fatalities were overturned vehicles. And in my forklift training, I always reflect back onto the film that was developed. Notice I said film, was developed back in the 90s, related to forklift and overturns. And the video is quite dated now, but also has some very good information. But it does really get into the nitty-gritty details of why people are getting crushed in overturned vehicles. And can anyone tell me why people are getting crushed by the equipment that they're working in? What would be probably a glaring indicator of what has occurred and what they were struck by as an operator? Any thoughts, folks?
Seatbelt.
Seatbelt.
Boy, and it's probably one of the most, you're all right. And it's probably one of the most common things I see out there through site inspections and evaluations is I see folks not wearing seat belts. And so the seat belts, even if you're on level grade, we are still moving around material, and the higher we lift that material, depending on the lifts that we're operating, our center of gravity changes, and that stability triangle changes a tremendous amount. And even though you can have some of the most experienced operators out there, you oftentimes see them not utilizing forklifts. And those restraints, as you all know, keep you in the cage. And that's the actual name of that video back in the 90s, Stay in the Cage. And because once that lift starts to go and we hit that tipping moment, crash, boom, bang, it's usually the rollover protection that is crushing the operator that should have protected them in the first place had they wore the seatbelt. And while it seems like just a constant reminder to folks, it is so critically important because it is the #1 cause of fatalities according to OSHA. And it's not far behind pedestrian injuries and dropping material as well. But here's a closer look at that fatality trend. I pulled some statistics from some different areas, but forklift overturns were about 25% of the deaths. So 1 in 4 right there, bam. Of all forklift fatalities that occurred in 2018, 99% were male and 1% were female, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Now, fatality rates occurred the highest in 2018 between 55 and 64 years old on that particular year with 23 deaths, according to the BLS. And in 2018, there were 20 forklift-related deaths occurred as a result of being struck by equipment. So we can see just not far behind, as I mentioned, people on the ground getting into those caught between and crushed by injury situations on those lifts working in close proximity. So we can see where we want to start focusing some of our training efforts to talk to folks about these and share these statistics and what the importance of these understanding these situations are to ensure safe work procedures. And so most common accidents, we talked about a few of these: collisions with pedestrians. And then we also see struck by falling material, and then crushed by the forklift and the surface. Yikes. And we talked about that one. And then fall from the platform on the forks. There are certain requirements that will allow us to work from an elevated position in a engineered basket attached to forks, provided it is engineered and you do have tabulated data and you do have the manufacturer's nod or written approval that you can utilize that attachment for hoisting personnel. But there's also some very specific regulations that we need to take a close look at. I've been in many fixed industry situations and also a few in construction where you see somebody throw a pallet on some forks and elevate themselves up to reach an upper area, maybe an upper truss or a sprinkler system, or setting something or retrieving something from an upper level. We also see accidents with a victim on or in a moving forklift and then crushed by forklift due to heavy load and overturn, as we can see in that last pictogram. Now, the fatality forklift accidents, causes, where and why. I provided you just a little bit of detail on percentages here. The fatality accident type, crushed by vehicle tipping over, this was 42%. Crushed between vehicle and the surface was 25%. Crushed between two vehicles was 11%. Struck or run over by a forklift was 10%. And then we see some falling material and fall from a platform. And Randy also talked about falling from heights. Remember, folks, it doesn't take a long distance to generate a lot of force. In fact, a 200-pound person falling 10 foot onto a hard surface creates approximately 12,000 foot-pounds of energy. And so we don't bounce like a rubber ball. We pop like a water balloon. And that's something that we don't want to see happen. And that's why it's so important to ensure that this appropriate information is conveyed. Here's just another picture, and we can kind of take a look at this here. In the U.S., as I mentioned, 1 out of 6 of all workplace deaths are forklift related. And then we start to see some different numbers. And so you'll find some different statistics out there, about 110 major forklift accidents every year. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is an injury. It just could be a property loss. And that cost businesses a whopping sum of money just in losses. And it costs more than 100 worker deaths every single year. So we generally see about 1 fatality every 3 days related to forklifts. And so preventing accidents, folks, it starts with training, right? But also management commitment to ensure that training has been implemented. And studies show that many of these accidents could have been prevented by better training. So I'm going to tell you this. I have been involved in a couple cases related to workplace injuries. And looking at information discoverable information that was provided to me. I've taken a look at some of the training documentation or lack thereof that's out there, and I'll tell you, and this doesn't go for everybody, but what I've seen in these situations is that the documentation or the training that was provided was not adequate. Okay. It's just what it comes down to. It's just more, it seems like more of an aloof, maybe, yeah, we did it. Yeah, we talked about it. Yeah, we talked about some of the basics. But after looking deeper into the information, in my opinion, I would say, hey, there is so much more room for improvement here. So we can't just go fly by the seat of our pants. We got to make sure that if we're going to spend the time and pay the burden wage as the employer to provide this training, that it is done and that it is effective and it is done by someone who has those qualifications. And I'm going to be talking about that here in just a few. No one starts with the innate knowledge, skills, and ability to safely operate a forklift. All right. Just because you have operated a riding lawnmower does not mean that you know how to operate a forklift. All right. I've heard some different things out there, but state and federal regulations require that drivers must be properly trained. And I'm going to spell out what the regulations say and tell you a little more detail as well. Operating a forklift without training is dangerous business, and I oftentimes hear it referred to as imagine somebody who's never had any driver training or time behind the wheel getting out there on the road. I mean, as you all know, those of you who live in the greater Puget Sound area, there's been some experienced operators of motor vehicles probably for decades that it's questionable whether or not they should have their license. So hopefully it's not any of you. Don't take any offense. But it's crazy out there, and so we add some different elements that a forklift operates entirely different than a vehicle. We can see some different things that can occur. Now, proper forklift safety training helps protect your business, and I have a number of things here: injury and death of employees, of course, loss of life and disabling injuries is something that we all strive to prevent. Also, regulatory fines for non-compliance. That might be just a standard inspection, but oftentimes we generally see these fines when we see an injury occur, and then maybe the department provides a little bit deeper investigation to a company's record-keeping process and determines that it was inadequate, or in comes Brian and Paget and his team over there, and they start digging deeper into this documentation, and it doesn't take a lot of digging to find out there are inadequacies. And remember, in this industry, you only have to be found 1% liable to be essentially responsible in construction. So liabilities, loss of resources, high insurance premiums, higher maintenance costs, property and product damage. And so OSHA found that there was a 61% improvement in operator performance scores after training had occurred. And there's a lot of details as you dig deeper into that, but you can clearly see there was a substantial improvement that OSHA has identified. Now let's talk about some of the power. Yeah, question. Somebody have a question? Or heard somebody have a shout out there? Feel free to speak up at any point in time, folks. I don't have the chat room in front of me, so if you are posting any questions in the chat room, maybe Mr. Ducey, you could interject and let me know. So, powered industrial truck operator training. Here's what it says, folks, the nitty-gritty details. The employer shall ensure that each powered industrial truck operator is competent to operate a powered industrial truck safely, and that each operator has successfully completed the training and has been evaluated by a qualified trainer. You can see those words, employer and qualified trainer, bringing focus in on those. And so what does the effective training need to address? Well, there's generally four major areas of concern. Obviously, the general hazards that apply to the operation of the equipment. And of course, there's varying different types of equipment out there, and also the hazards associated with operations of the specific equipment. And then we also have to address general workplace hazards, and I'll give you some details on that here in a couple slides. But not only the general workplace hazards that we might encounter from project to project, but the hazards of the workplace where the equipment is operated. And so I have to lean back onto the fatality that Randy gave us a little information on the scissor lift. And as he mentioned, it was reported that it hit a floor hole cover. that maybe wasn't adequate to support the weight of the lift. We're not sure on the details, so I have to put a disclaimer on that, as I'm not 100% sure, and we won't know until the investigation has been completed. But we have to ensure that the surfaces that we're operating our lifts will support not only the lifts that we're operating, but also the loads that they're carrying. And in this state, who knows how much a floor hole cover should support or must support? Anybody? Hopefully y'all can still hear me. I think y'all are in silence, but 4 times the intended load.
2 times the axle load, right?
Well, you would go that for OSHA, but then we start looking at the Washington code where floor hole covers would be 4 times the intended load. So we have to ensure that the surfaces that we're operating on are indeed going to support that capacity, but also in conjunction with the load weight. And so operator training, this is where the rubber meets the road, pun intended. Training shall consist of the following, must consist of the following, okay? Shall, must, you got to do it. That's what that means. So you have to do formal instruction. And I always refer to this as the academic portion of the training, which can include a lecture. It should include a lecture, a discussion. You might have some interactive computer learning. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you should include a written test, okay, to ensure competency of this instruction. Here's the deal, folks. You tell me, is a 5-question test adequate for an operator to ensure competency on the academic portion of the training? Is a 10-question test adequate? Is a 20-question test adequate? Is a 30-question test adequate? Look, in my professional opinion, if you don't have a test out there with 30, 35 questions for something like this, I think you're cutting it short. You got room for improvement on this, okay? The 10 generic questions that you're asking in the test that we see floating around the industry isn't going to cut it, folks. If you want to make sure that your people know, challenge them. Sit down and put together tests. Pull in the resources. Put together a good test and make sure that those folks pass that test, because that is one of the elements to ensure that they have demonstrated competency on the information that you provided. Now, practical training, folks, as you know, it includes a hands-on demonstration by the trainer and also exercises by the trainee. Now, let me repeat that. Hands-on demonstration by the trainer and exercises by the trainee on the model and lifts that will be utilized. So if you have a sign-in sheet of a forklift training that says forklift training, and you have not identified the classification or the make and model of that equipment, you are out of compliance. Okay, it's not going to cut it. A forklift is not just a generalization that we can operate 6 or 7 classes or the 6 classifications of forklifts. If you have a walkie pallet jack versus a riding pallet jack, difference, right? We got to have an operation of each of those equipment, and that trainer has to verify that that operator has indeed performed that practical portion of that training, which also rolls into the evaluation. And of course, they're both one and the same, is that, or similar, if you will, is the effectiveness of the training needs to be done by observing the performance while doing actual work using the forklift. Now, oftentimes we'll put out a pallet. We might stack a few boxes. We might have a traffic control device on a fork. Depending on the type of lift that we're operating during training, we will oftentimes set up an obstacle course where someone will have to operate back in, pull out, utilize all functions of that equipment to ensure that we do see safe operation. And there are times where you will get somebody on a lift and they are, it's a little bit scary and they might not have a lot of experience. But of course, that's what we're doing, is training people to ensure that they can perform safe operations prior to the commencement of actual work activity. So what we'll do is we'll nix that person and say, look, we're not going to issue a card for this individual or a certification until someone from the company who is a qualified evaluator spends some time with this individual to ensure that they are comfortable and aren't putting anybody in danger, prior to actually lifting heavy loads. And so we always encourage people to be familiar with those controls on equipment and work with a qualified person who does have extensive training, experience, professional certificate, degree, etc., associated with that particular subject matter, which is commonly the definition for qualified person. Now, operator training requirements: the employer or qualified person chosen by the employer must have the knowledge, training, and experience. Those are three very important things to train and evaluate forklift operators and in operating instructions. Okay. Also, the warnings, the precautions for the forklifts they will be authorized to use. Let me ask you this question here. It's a big question. Do you think someone who has never driven a car should teach driver's education? Think about it. Interesting concept. The trainee can only operate the forklift when directly supervised by such a person, and that person shall ensure that the operation during that training portion does not endanger anyone, as I mentioned. So these are things to think about, folks. Now, training program options. What can you do, right? How can you achieve this to get this certification? Because quite honestly, a lot of times we don't have time, or we have subcontractors coming in. We aren't, for those of you who have subcontractors out there, general contractors aren't requesting or may not be requesting operator certification. We have an influx of personnel coming into site. How do we track and trace and identify who is qualified to operate a forklift? Well, that's oftentimes left on the shoulders of safety professionals to verify that operators are adequately trained. And if they aren't, then what should we do? Well, we can hire a local safety consultant to perform the training and evaluation, or you can have them develop a tailored training program for your company that you can implement. And that kind of coincides with number 2 here, where you take a train the trainer course from a local organization where you can obtain knowledge and course material. And we have a variety of different train the trainer courses available in our local area, which many of you are familiar with. And a quick Google search on the web will bring those local organizations up, unless you already have them on speed dial. Now, you can develop your own internal training program. Okay, so while you can get course material from a train the trainer program, which is something that I highly recommend, you can develop your own internal training program, because a general training program might not cover those specific workplace procedures. So while you are getting a canned program, it may not be specific to your workplace. Then again, it might be very close to what you're doing, but we can utilize that material that's been developed and use it as a benchmark to improve. And that's what we have to do as safety folks out there, is improve our processes, right? We do the best we can do. And then once we find out that it wasn't as good as we can do, we try to do even better. And that's the mindset that we have to have when it comes to training. And as you can all see, I'm very passionate about training and the importance of conveying appropriate information to folks. So if we're going to take the time to sit down and talk shop, it better be worth something. So evaluations, requirements. What do we have to do for evaluations? Well, there's got to be an evaluation of each powered industrial truck operator's performance that's conducted after the initial training, okay, that academic portion. Also after any refresher training. And when does that refresher training have to happen? I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's got to be done at least once every 3 years, folks. If you don't have some sort of documentation for your forklift operators within the past 3 years, you are out of compliance. Remember, this is evaluation requirements. This is very black and white. As you can see, I have a forklift operator form that I've just pulled directly off the web. Just to give you an example here, you can have various different types of forklift operator evaluator forms. It doesn't necessarily say in the standard what you have to, or what type of form you have to have. You just have to verify that evaluation has been performed. So if you see these things to the right-hand column, which might be very small on your screen currently, this is just a variety of items, and then you can, again, develop your own checklist or way of evaluating. But these are some of the basics that we should be looking at. And there's a lot of examples floating around out there on the web. This evaluation form at minimum, if you have a qualified operator, been operating forklifts, various different types of forklifts, say class 5 and all terrains, class 7s, and they've been operating these. I've been operating them for 30 years, Rhett. I haven't had a certification in 25 years. Well, you're setting yourself up for possible litigation based on injury or accident when we haven't taken that time to sit down and ensure that this person is properly evaluated in their operation. Now, evaluation may only take 5 minutes per individual, so it's not a heck of a lot of time to spend on evaluation. But of course, you could spend a much longer duration on that evaluation portion, dependent on the needs of your organization and the hazards associated with the work that you do. And so when is refresher training required? Well, it's got to be given if the operation has been involved in an accident. Okay, this is verbatim out of the standard: near miss or unsafe operations. So while I said that 3-year period for evaluation and or refresher training, if you have fallen into this category and had an accident or near miss and the training has not been provided, refresher training, you are out of compliance. So oftentimes when we document an incident, maybe it was drop material or near hit, and that individual has not been retrained per the standard. Of course, we're setting ourselves up for non-compliance. And in addition, if an operator is assigned to a new type of forklift, absolutely, folks, or if a workplace condition changes that could affect the safety, then refresher training is required. So it could be much less than that 3-year period. It could be twice a year in some cases, depending on what you have somebody operating and what your work sites look like. But the employer, what I've seen through my business is that the employer will often choose to have trainees participate in both refresher training and evaluation every 3 years. It's not these programs can be accomplished in tandem with one another. Oftentimes they'll have folks that have neither had training or evaluation and combine them in a class with experienced personnel. And I always encourage employers, find who those qualified people are who have been operating lists for a real long time. Even if they haven't been, or if they haven't been certified, get them in the class with the folks that don't have the experience so they can share their experience. And that's a very important or crucial part of the training that I provide is involvement of people in our class. Is that who in here has had scenarios where they have had near misses or near hits, and it is awesome to get that communication going. Communication is key, folks, and when we can learn from other people's experience, we've definitely done good, if you will. So hearing from those folks who do have boots on the ground, who have been in the industry for a while, can be very, very beneficial, even more beneficial than the training that can be provided by an employer or even a third party. Now, training and evaluation documentation, if an operator has previous forklift training, okay, so somebody comes onto your site or is sent to you from a different project or pulled from the hall or whatever it might be, the employer must document that the training covered in that past training course covers the required topics as outlined in the standards. And as I just mentioned, you remember in the standards, it says specific to your workplace, specific to your lifts. So if somebody comes in and gives you a card and says, yeah, I have been trained, here is my card, you might even have to dig a little bit deeper in some circumstances, or at least provide an evaluation in conjunction with that qualifying card to ensure that the person has been informed and evaluated specifically to your work site. Now, the operator must have been evaluated in the current workplace within the last 3 years, and the employer has to keep record that shows that each forklift operator has been trained on all the specifics that we talk about. And what do the records have to include? Well, it's got to have the name of the operator, it's got to have the date of training and evaluation, and it also has to have the name of the qualified person who provided the training and evaluation. And so training program requirements, the topics listed in this table must be covered at a minimum when training an operator. Those of you who have seen this document before will know that it came or was derived from a publication from the Department of Labor and Industries. And as you can see in the left-hand column, topics related to powered industrial trucks. I mean, I'm just going to read through some of these. This is, again, directly from a workbook provided by L&I, operating instructions. All right. Now, that can vary because it varies based on the equipment that we're utilizing. Warnings and precautions for the types of powered industrial trucks the operator will be authorized to operate. Differences between lifts and an automobile. Lift controls and instrumentation, where they're located, what they do, how they work. Engine and motor operations, steering and maneuvering. Visibility is also a big one, including restrictions during loading or unloading. Also, any attachments and operation and use limitations associated with those attachments and requirements thereof. You should have different capacity and stability information in your training program requirements. And this is where we start getting into some math and crunching numbers and actually looking at the details, the load charts and whatnot. Also, any inspection and maintenance the operator will be required to perform. I'll talk about that here on the next slide. refueling, charging of batteries, operating limitations, and any other operating instructions, warnings, precautions listed. Now get this is a very key word in the operator's manual for the types of the powered industrial trucks the employee is being trained to operate. Now, if you go over to the right-hand column here, of course, those are general workplace topics and then associated with the lifts, and then topics related to your workplace, surface conditions, compositional loads and stability, load manipulation, stacking and unstacking, pedestrian traffic where you're going to be operating, or site personnel traffic, narrow aisles or restricted places, where the lifts will be operated. Use of door opening and closing devices, hazardous locations that fall under that classifications that we talked about initially in this presentation. Also ramps and other slope surfaces that could affect a powered industrial truck stability, closed environments and other areas where insufficient ventilation can build up carbon monoxide from that incomplete combustion of those internal combustion engines, and also other unique or potentially hazardous environmental conditions in the workplace that could affect safe operation. Now, look, Labor and Industries has done a very good job on providing us the details that we need to cover. Expand on this, folks. Expand on it. Make it specific to your work environment if you are indeed performing training internally. Now, if a specific topic does not apply to the forklift in the employer's workplace, covering it is optional, but this should be a checklist, okay? We should be having this documented with every forklift operator out there. If you aren't doing it, you're out of compliance. Now, owner's manual and maintenance requirements, here's another big one too. State and federal standards require that the forklift be checked for defects the first time it's placed in service and every day that the forklift is used. Every day that the forklift is used. If it's not used that day, doesn't need to happen. The owner's manual typically has an inspection checklist that you can use and, of course, build on. There's a lot of different resources that are out there, folks, and I've just pulled one right off the web. Just took me a few minutes of search just to pull something up to give you a very generic overview of what this looks like. And, of course, based on the lift that you're operating, check the manufacturer's manuals, okay? Because they generally have this checklist available that's specific to that lift. And if there's not something available in the operator's manual, which there generally is, then of course you can put something together. Now, shall or should these inspections be documented? What do you all think out there? This is a loaded question. What do you think? Shall or should these inspections be documented?
Shall.
I heard one for shall. What do you think? Anybody else have
Shall.
Shall. Well, I like those answers. You know, as a safety professional and a consultant, I always tell folks, look, if you didn't document it, it never happened. And so this is probably one of the biggest issues that I see regarding record keeping. Well, one of the few record keeping issues is inspections not being documented. Everybody, well, not everybody, but folks ask me, Rhett, does it have to be documented? And I said, well, you know, I guess it depends. And that's a term that Rick Gleason has coined for years. If you are doing the inspection, you have to document anytime there is any issue or repair needed. And so, yeah, we should be documenting these and most likely shall be documenting these to ensure that we do have that record keeping backed up. Now, the owner's manual and maintenance records or maintenance requirements, the forklift and owner's manual is a very important aspect of training, folks. When I've on a few of these cases that I've looked at that involve different types of lifts, I have seen through, you know, on-site interviews of personnel who've been qualified to operate these lifts have never cracked an operator's manual open. They don't even know where to find it. They might say, oh, it's on the lift, or oh, it's in the job trailer. Oh, I don't know. Nobody's ever told me about it before. The operator's manual is a critical component of the specifics associated with that lift. And if you aren't incorporating the information in that manual as it applies to your training, you're missing the ball. Okay, you can't just say, oh, hey, the operator's manual is in the cab. If you have questions, look at the operator's manual. You can't say that. It's important to make sure you break it out. You show people it's a living document. Hey, take a look here, or incorporate some of the information that's applicable to your work environment in your training program based on the lifts that you're operating. Give some examples. Make it available to employees. You must have the manual, so be sure the information it contains is provided to the trainees. Of course, we can't cover every word in that operator's manual. Some can be quite extensive, but there are very specific pieces of information that I personally would include, or at least have folks open up and take a peek at. And so keep a record of any maintenance that is performed on that forklift, as well as any repairs that are made into the lift. So that kind of coincides with the past slide that I talked about, is shall or should these inspections be documented? Well, they shall, because we need to document that maintenance and record keeping, or repairs rather, were dialed in. And so, folks, the summary of this all is being proactive. It is the very best approach, right? A robust, comprehensive, and ongoing safety training program for your forklift operators increases operators' efficiency. It makes your operators experts on the equipment, even more so than maybe they think, and reduces risk of injury. It also reduces forklift repair costs and inventory losses. And oftentimes it speeds up operations. If we have skilled operators out there that are doing what they need to do, production can also be improved. And it also helps retain good workers who are trained in those skills, and encourages not only forklift good habits, but just good work habits in general, and also helps keep you in compliance. And overall, and the bottom line is it helps your operation run more efficiently and keeps people safe. And that's why we have to really pay conscious mind to this, and make sure that our training programs, and beyond even forklifts as well, is make sure that we are spending that time effectively to cover the information that's going to truly make a difference. If we aren't engaging students or trainees, boy, it's fallen on deaf ears, folks. And those of you who've been out there in the training world know exactly what I'm talking about. So take the time, spend some time on this information, and develop a training program, or hire a third party to come in and provide that insight and expertise. So I want to thank everybody. And of course, there again is my information, which I never post up there. But since I'm doing the presentation today, I figured I'd give our company a plug, Safety, Health, and Environmental Services. I'd like to open it up for any questions, comments, discussion. Again, just an overview on training, folks, but I'd love to hear from you. Any questions, comments? It was a little bit shorter segment today, but yet still very critical information.